In the first part of this series on the cell, we examined the structure and function of the cell membrane. We learned that the cell membrane was composed of lipid molecules forming a selectively permeable barrier for the cell because inside the membrane are proteins that act as channels. In this part, we'll focus on the cell cytoplasm, and in future lessons we'll look at mitochondria and the nucleus. So the cytoplasm is the thick fluid between the nucleus and the outer cell membrane. Consisting of water, proteins, and many other types of molecules, much of the chemistry of life happens here. So here we see two cheek cells, the outer cell membrane, we have the nuclear membrane there, and so all this fluid in here would be the cytoplasm. Now, before we said, well, it was important to import food into the cell because this is a source of energy and building materials to do the chemistry of life. So now it's time to dig a little deeper. What exactly is the chemistry of life? Well, let's take our food molecule, glucose, for example. For a typical animal cell, this is the principal energy molecule for the cell. So the chemistry of life includes extracting energy from food, and food for cells comes in the form of molecules. So here we have a food molecule, and the idea here is some of the chemistry involves getting energy out of this molecule. Now, before we take a look at the role of the proteins, we need to briefly mention what do we mean by energy. So let's take a look at what we mean by energy. In physics, energy is the ability to do work. And we'll identify two kinds of energy: kinetic energy, the energy of motion, and potential energy, the energy of position. Now in a moment we'll see how these two apply to this case of the Hoover Dam. This is the Hoover Dam. You're looking down from the top of the dam here, and you're looking out downstream from the dam in this picture. Let's use two familiar examples to understand potential and kinetic energy. The first one here, we just simply have a weight that is suspended on a rope. Now we're going to define this object as having potential energy because it exists at a certain height from the surface of the Earth. And because we live on an object that has mass, the Earth, there is a gravitational force that will be pulling on this object. And should we cut the rope, the object will fall. It will accelerate as a consequence of that force, and that acceleration means it will be gaining speed. So it's gaining kinetic energy, the energy of motion. So what's happening then when we cut the rope, the potential energy is being transformed into kinetic energy, the energy of motion. The higher the object is above the surface of the Earth, the more potential energy it would have, because if we were to cut the rope, it would have a greater speed when it finally hit the Earth. For the swing situation over here, it's a nice example of the transformation of potential into kinetic and then back into potential. So let's say at the highest point on the swing here, this person is a certain height. It's the highest distance from the Earth, so it has the highest potential energy, and that person is not moving. For an instant, the person's not moving, no kinetic energy. Well, now the force of gravity is going to pull on that person. The person's potential energy, some of it will be transformed into kinetic energy. Notice at this low point here, the person has maximum speed, but they still have some potential energy, but it's not as much. They're a little lower, right? So they're closer to the Earth's surface. So it's the difference in potential energy here that has been transformed into the energy of motion. Well, now the person has energy of motion, so their momentum will take them higher and higher and higher up to the highest point over here. Notice then the energy of motion, kinetic energy, has been transformed into potential energy because the person stops moving for a moment here, but they're higher from the ground. So again, we see potential energy being transformed into kinetic energy transformed into potential energy. Now let's briefly consider the dam. Imagine on this bridge up here we had a bucket of water, right? And well, if we simply just poured the water out here, that water is going to fall, right? Now initially it had potential energy because it had height above the surface of the Earth, and as that water falls, it'll gain speed, right? So it'll increase its kinetic energy of motion. Well, what the dam operators are doing is all the water that is backed up by this dam, that water is going to be used to drive a turbine to make electricity. So in a sense, the water is going to be falling down through the dam, and the potential energy of the water is transformed into kinetic energy, and that kinetic energy is turning a turbine. The turbine makes electricity. So what does all this have to do with cells and molecules? Well, we want to think of food molecules as storing potential energy. And the energy that we'll consider is the energy that is stored in these chemical bonds. And now here we see the role of proteins. Specialized proteins, uniquely suited for this task, begin a chemical breakdown of the food molecule. So for example, this protein here, it's going to interact with the food molecule and it's going to perform a chemical reaction on the molecule. And then after this one's finished with the molecule, then the next one, it's a different specialized protein. It's specialized to do the next interaction, and then the next one, and then the next one. Now they don't all sort of know what they're doing. They're just bumping around in the cytoplasm of the cell. But when they interact with their given target molecule, they will perform a chemical reaction. Well, the result of the chemical reaction is that a chemical bond might be broken. And when a chemical bond is broken, energy is released. So what we have here is potential energy. The energy stored in the chemical bond can be transformed, can be released in a sense when that chemical bond is broken. Now what happens to the energy when the chemical bond is broken? We'll see that energy can be used to build a different chemical bond, and some of it escapes as heat as well. Now all these types of chemical reactions that are operating on food molecules and so on by this team of proteins, we're going to call this set of reactions metabolism. So metabolism is the set of chemical reactions that keep the cell alive. These reactions are performed by proteins, and some reactions involve harnessing energy from food to power the chemistry of life. So this is just one set of chemical reactions that we're going to call metabolism. We'll see that there are other reactions involved in building molecules. That's also metabolism. In the next part then, we'll take a look at the structure called the mitochondria, and it is in the mitochondria where the final breakdown of food molecules occurs. The purpose of this chemistry is to extract energy from food.